Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is another episode in the series on radicalism in the English Revolution. My guest today is Nigel Smith, and we are here to talk about the Ranters. Nigel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's begin. Before we really get to who they are and their ideas, can you situate them a little bit in this revolutionary moment? What time are they active? Maybe where are they active? What are these Ranters up to, and in the arc of the revolution?
Okay, well, if we speak of them as a group, and that's a problematic thing, but if we speak of them as a group, they emerge in the period after the trial and execution of the king and the establishment of the Republic. But that very establishment also results in the defeat of the Levellers. The Levellers being the popular movement that had tried to persuade the people with power, the army, and one faction of the Parliament, the so-called independents, to broaden the suffrage. Often it is said that their real interest in broadening the suffrage was to enable greater religious toleration, because many of these people had religious views which were beginning to go far beyond a Puritan or Calvinist consensus position. So there are two kinds of Levellers. There are the civilian Levellers, very identifiable in the City of London, and also the Levellers in the New Model Army, sometimes called agitators. And they had tried to make these constitutional reforms adopted in the very rapid movement in late 1648 into early 1649 to put the king on trial and to execute him. There was Leveller resistance in the early months of the Republic, but it was suppressed, famously in English history now. And there was a sense that another solution had to be found, because levelling with the sword, as Abbé Cobb, the chief ranter, would say, was no solution. So the Ranters were happening at the same time as the diggers. So the digging the land in common, with Gerard Winstanley as the most visible leader, and the most visible community being on St George's Hill in Surrey. That was one solution to the failure of levelling, and the other solution was ranting. Now, what is the ranter position? Well, it's many different things, and some have argued quite influentially in the 1980s that it wasn't anything at all. It was a chimera made up by hostile, largely Orthodox Puritan commentators who were worried about a threat that it presented to the social order. So this is what it was. As the Puritan Revolution through the 1640s triumphed, we can say that, as Parliament went on to win the Civil War. So much more liberal or different versions of Puritanism emerged, which I don't think any of the Presbyterians, who were the mainstream Puritan faction, opposed originally to the king, certainly to the Church of England as it then was, far beyond the reforms they wanted. And the theology that is usually associated with Ranterism is called antinomianism, quite literally against the law. So, put in a nutshell, the position that you feel assured that you are saved, so that nothing you do can endanger the position of your salvation. You have grace. And so the theology emerges as a reaction against the severely disciplinary control of Orthodox Protestant Calvinism. You might say that the High Church of England, Archbishop Laud's version, which Charles I particularly liked, was also a reaction against it in what the Puritans would have said was a reversion to Romish practices, ceremonies, and a pulling away from hard predestination theology, the belief that you are predestined before you are born, either to damnation or to salvation, and your life is spent looking for signs of which way things are going to go. The Ranters would say that's a doctrine of despair, and so the sense that your belief was a sign of your own state of grace, that you didn't have to obey a moral code like the Ten Commandments. That was the obvious one. And also that you could not, that there wasn't any point in obeying church rules like ordinances, particular orders of service. You should certainly read the Bible, and you should discuss it. You should know it. You should be able to debate it. You sit there with your fellow believers, and you as it were enhance your sense of salvation by worshiping God, listening to sermons, long sermons, and increasingly experiencing a spiritual religion with an inward sense of inspiration and salvation that is progressively relying less and less on things visible and external, kind of levitation. We usually talk about two kinds of antinomianism. Antinomianism is very, very popular with many people who were not at all ranters, but they're particularly attracted to the sermons of a divine called Tobias Crisp, who had a rich living in Wiltshire. And his sermons, for instance, became very popular reading matter in the New Model Army. So the two kinds of antinomianism that we have are, as it were, theoretical antinomianism, where you are simply very serenely aware of your grace, or practical antinomianism, where you actually do things that some people might consider as sinful. And this leads us to another aspect that does arise in some of the Ranter writings, and it's sometimes associated with later antinomians like Rasputin, the ill-fated advisor in the late days of the Tsar's court in Russia. You've got to know sin, you've got to sin and pass through it. And if your state of grace is secure, it doesn't really matter what you do. So you can see that form is a particularly intense way of combating very disciplinary Calvinism, which is, in a sense, Calvinism is trying to inculcate a severely rigid personal discipline. So there are two features that the Ranters practiced. One is swearing.
Is that why they're called Ranters? I realize I don't actually know.
Yes, that's why they're called Ranters.
Okay.
Blaspheming. So, and the most famous ranter, Abiezer Copp, who was born in 1621. He's from Warwick in the West Midlands, and the son of an artisan, got to be well educated, proved to be a talent at the local grammar school, and was eventually sent to Oxford and had the power of preaching. By the time he's taken his ranter position in the later 1640s, he's clearly rejecting the disciplinary Calvinism that he was encouraged to have before, and goes to London extravagantly swearing as a way of attacking what by then he regarded as severely selfish Puritan piety. That Puritanism was a justification for covetousness. And so in Copp's writing, there is a kind of egalitarian message, and he deliberately embraces and kisses destitute people, especially women. His own writing is a kind of psychomachia. It's a drama of finding within him a character whom he calls the Holy Scripturian whore, a female incarnation of the Calvinist version of the Scripture, who is telling him not to do this because it'll be bad for him. And as it were, he's exercising this spirit by swearing and casting it out of himself, and hugging and clipping the she gypsies dearly. So what he means by gypsies, I don't think we've thought hard enough about yet. But if they were, as it were, nomadic people who were living outside of normal English society, then they were probably poor. And he is manifesting community with them. That's the important thing. The holy community. And God is within you. Kopp believes that when he is opening his mouth in this frame of mind, God is speaking. And he has a parenthetical other voice, which is he, Abiezer Kopp, who sort of speaks in the tract as well. So God is speaking. I, the mighty God, say, and then a couple of sentences later, there's a parenthesis that opens, and it says, "But if you meet anyone, you don't have to tell them this." So it's a kind of really interesting schizophrenic writing, and is I think belongs with the best of Puritan spiritualism, the sense of a personal connection with God or with divinity in some way. So Kopp was certainly in trouble. He was active in Coventry, which is of course very close to Warwick, and in the couple of years before ranting emerges, you'd really call Kopp a seeker. These are people who are they had been Baptists basically and believed in adult baptism. That would be the main thing. They'd imbibed antinomian theology. They'd flipped from predestination to this version of antinomianism, and some of them were actually even preaching universal redemption, that everyone is saved, come what may. You can see the sense in which the pressures of the time and the kind of lives they'd lived, searching through different versions of English Protestantism to find salvation, that they throw over predestination in the end because it was all too traumatic. And there'd been a civil war, and the social order had been totally taken apart. So a community of people in a small village somewhere between Oxford and Coventry, that's where Kopp was hanging out for some time. It's very interesting that he chose to attack in his first significant tract, the gloriously titled "Some Sweet Sips of Some Spiritual Wine." He actually attacked the order of grammar and basically said that, when people, and he mostly meant at this time boys, when they learned Latin and were taught the complexities of Latin grammar, they're actually misunderstanding it. It's not the different moods of Latin should be understood to take you to the spirit within, and the optative mood is on the way to it. So it's a transformation of formal learning, which Presbyterian Puritanism was very good at using, and the learned English Baptists also, great men of learning, scriptural commentators, some of them. It's flipped into a sense of imminent inspiration. It's not that Jesus is returning sometime soon. He's already here, right within us. That is it. Now, the other branch, if you will, of Ranterism is, or the other branch of practical antinomianism is the only way we can experience this community, this revelation of God within us, is to throw off all social bonds and commune in nature. And that's where the allegations of free love, of sex outside marriage or sex beyond marriage, and orgies, communal sex, are made. It's very, very hard to pin down what actually happened, and the hostile treatises that began to appear present the Ranters as a bunch of people who met for orgies in inns, public houses, and it's, if not satanic, certainly pagan. There's a certain amount of rhetoric in that. And so the other Ranter writer, The second most significant ranter writer is Lawrence Clarkson, who really had his own following, even though he and Kopp knew about each other. Clarkson says in his autobiography, which he wrote long after he ceased to be a ranter, called The Lost Sheep Found, he talks about preaching, and he had a wife, but he went on the road as a traveling preacher, and he celebrated the spirit by sleeping with other women. But by then, when he was writing, he was a Muggletonian, and he joined another sect, whom I guess in a future episode of your podcast you can discuss. And we won't bother to talk about them. But is he reliable? That's the question. But what I would say, first of all, that Clarkson's theology, which is basically metaphysically trying to abolish the difference between light and dark and good and evil, and basically says everything is one thing, a single eye, all light, no darkness. So you've got to embrace experience and find your divinity within it, however it comes. So that's a sort of different spin on antinomianism to Kopp. Kopp is well educated, and Clarkson is not. He's kind of uneducated, and his first pieces of writing are very hard to read. He is the Cormac McCarthy character of the English Revolution. There was a group in London called My One Flesh, which several people talk about. Clarkson claims to have been a member. Kopp knew about it. I think something was going on there. I've come to see, and I need to write more about this, even in a Baptist church, with the drive to insisting on the perfection, the saved status of every member of a church, so that everyone in it ought to be a believer. And there are, even before the Civil War, there are proto-sectarian groups where the allegation was, and I think fairly reasonably so, that women who were married to other people have been charismatic. They've been very impressed by the charisma of this or that preacher, and they, as it were, fallen in love with them. And I think these dynamics exist in Baptist churches, and some of these seeker groups that emerge from them, so that on the other side of the time of the Commonwealth, there is a well-known, by the time we get to the 1650s, he's a Baptist. He's several other things before that, called Thomas Tillam, Tillam. As an Americanist, you've probably read his poem on New England. It's in many anthologies.
Yeah, I have. It's been a while, though.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. It is like the bread and butter of early American literature. Yeah. He was briefly in New England. Tillam, it's very exciting. We've just uncovered a manuscript treatise in a library in Germany. Tillam wrote Justifying Divorce. And now he's not the only Baptist to do that. And there was a female Baptist street preacher called Elizabeth Attaway, who got hold of Milton's Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce in 1643 and started saying, this is it. This is my guidebook. I want to get rid of my husband because he's not in the same position as me. And I need to marry, I need a new husband in the faith. And she married another charismatic preacher called William Jenney. Or they were common law man and wife. Or they married each other by the rules of their breakaway church.
Oh, right.
And, to the Orthodox, and, most people, this is really terrifying. It's people making up the law, see fit. So I think that the feature of unorthodox, unbounded, heretical sexuality is a consequence of the drive towards the perfected antinomian church. And it is certainly, there's a strain of leveler and digger drive towards social equality or better representation in it. And you can see dynamics of the authority of male leaders, the authority of female leaders. It's quite beautifully visionary in places. Kopp has a female follower in Some Sweet Sips of Some Spiritual Wine, who she tells Kopp, she sent him a letter and he writes it down, or rather he it's printed in the tract, and it's an account of a dream she had in which she saw her own liberty, her own spiritual liberty. She was in an idyllic pastoral scene in a field by a stream. There were animals and fish all around her, being free, and she tried to put a collar on an animal, and it. So isn't that interesting? So this is a way of imagining, kinds of freedom and empowerment or fusion with your creator beyond and outside of the normal forms of hierarchy and disciplinary order by which English people lived. And they felt justified in doing this because everything had literally fallen apart.
Yeah. So I want to jump in there and say, first of all, what you just said is the perfect expression of what we might think of as anarchism or anarchy. Everything has fallen apart, and then a new order needs to be constructed. So that can open up into why I'm interested in these people, and we can talk about all sorts of things like punk rock and Emerson. We'll get there. The only other thing that I wanted to establish, though, before we move on to these questions is, if we've got this question of whether or not the Ranters actually existed and whether this was a real thing, my only big remaining establishing question is, and I think you've touched on this, but just the sort of social element of this. It sounds like there's not maybe ranting communities in the same way there's digging communities, and what are the relationships between people like Kopp and Clarkson? I just want the listeners to be able to sort of imagine what this movement looked like if the levelers were printing pamphlets and agitating and doing demonstrations, and the diggers were diggers. Were the Ranters ranting together, or was it a pamphlet-based movement, or what did it look like?
It was both.
Both. Okay.
So there was a printer in London called Giles Calvert, or a publisher, who thought that this sudden sprouting at the very crisis of the English Revolution, this sudden sprouting of many different versions of a kind of religion of spiritual inspiration, of an inward God or a spirit within that was sustaining everything. He happily printed the works of many different figures, including the Ranters, and his shop was known as a meeting place. Kopp went to it, Clarkson went to it. We know that, they say so. And we also know that these tracts got around the country. People were fascinated by them. Puritan churches, congregational churches, self-governing congregations out there. For instance, there's a case in Norfolk, in Norwich, the third most important city in the country, where somebody's daughter has gotten hold of the fiery flying roll, Kopp's a fiery flying roll, and they talk about it in the church meetings. What are we going to do? And at the same time, these figures are moving around the country, and I think it looks like Clarkson was finding it easy to subsist on voluntary support contributions and so on. How this is all financed is a very interesting question, and something one again we should know more about. At the end of the day, the charismatic millenarian chiliastic movement that emerges is the Quakers, and it's often said that many people who'd been seekers, diggers and ranters eventually found Quakerism as the most robust form. And as we now understand quite well, the Quakers were very successful at using itinerant preaching and the printing press hand in hand. They'd go and hand out treatises for free, half a day ahead of the arrival of a preacher.
Okay. That's fantastic. I can't wait to ask Kate Peters about this when we talk about the Quakers. But I want to get to punk rock soon, but it looked like you had something to say when I used the A word, when I talked about the sort of anarchy of the country leading to anarchism of the Ranters. So I wanted to see if you had a comment you wanted to get in there before we.
Well, I don't. Oh, I suppose I'd be a little bit. I don't think they saw themselves as Kropotkinian anarchists,
Yes.
peaceful anarchists. Mm-hmm. I think they thought that the order, that God's order, was was to be found imminently in themselves, and they were coming awake to it. And if they simply acknowledged that, then and they would find liberty and freedom, spiritual freedom, as they understood it. They would all be liberated, and everything would be fulfilled. I don't think they think very hard at all about a social order. No speculation about how you would deal justice, which is in Winstanley's Law of Freedom, and enables people to say that Winstanley's social order was in fact very, very disciplinary and harsh.
Certainly by the time of that pamphlet, I spoke to John Morrill and Bernard Capp about the question of whether we can draw a line between the early Winstanley and the later Winstanley, and the answer is I think we don't know to what extent we can draw a line.
It's very hard to see how being a ranter went with everyday life. Do you rant in the evenings? Like you go to an ale house So I think these are matters still to be addressed, but there's not really a political theory in ranter writing. It operates on the level of, I think, how communities work. Joseph Salmon, who, if you will, is I would say the third most significant ranter writer, and of course, all the time we're using evidence from those who were literate and got to publish. There are lots of other people who professed and practiced, but leave no trace. So what would they have said? Could we interview them for a podcast? It's of course an open question. So I think he says he first of all, when I edited the ranter writings in the early 1980s, that we knew that there was a tract called Divinity Anatomized, but it had presumed to be lost. No one had a copy of it. It then turned up at the Clark Library in Los Angeles, and it's I would say so. In my second edition of the ranter writings, we have a copy of it. But the thing about it is, the language of it is extremely biblically symbolic and in places very erotic. And I can imagine that it afforded a sense of holy community, which embraced sanctified sexuality. But Salmon, in his recantation tract, does say, we were very foolish to try this on. Of course, no one would understand us. And I think that's it. I'm reminded of the Branch Davidians in Waco, which was going on, in the 1990s, and I'd published on the Ranters by then, and much more, and had and was thinking, channeling it through my knowledge of the 17th century. But they were a similar sect that had it was a Baptist church.
I believe so. The 90s was a while ago, but that sounds right to me.
Yeah, David Koresh, and I think they had created a polyamorous community, I believe, and then got into an unfortunate fight with the FBI. So the attraction of and the connection of alternative or heterodox sexual practice in perfected religions is something we see. It's Mormonism in one of its versions. Not accepted at all in the rest of society. So I think that's a pretty big part of the mindset that gets you to ranterism. In the moment of the defeat of the levelers, the rebellion by swearing and by free love, of course, is a potent objection to the elite that ran the Republic, the gentry and largely gentry elite that ran the Republic, saying, we're not having this.
Yeah, it seems like the both the fifth monarchists and the whatever we call them, the bare bones parliament, it seems like the ranters would be perhaps their greatest fear.
Yes. Well, so the fifth monarchists are the next phase. So the I'm sure Bernard Capp gave you a very accurate view of how the idea of reforming the Constitution, perfecting the Republic, as it were, in order to facilitate the return of King Jesus, becomes another form of resistance to the authority of the Commonwealth. It's a split, really, within the Republic. And yes, most of the Fifth Monarchists are kind of Calvinists.
Yeah.
But there is an antinomian edge to it.
Oh,
of
interesting.
Course. Some of them, and so did Bernard talk about Anna Trapnell, the prophet?
No, I don't. I don't believe we did. Yeah.
Oh, that was remiss.
Oh, well, that's my fault, probably.
No. But her visions. She's like punk priestess Patti Smith of the Fifth Monarchists. She prophesied in public in Whitehall, and it's a kind of and garnered a serious following. And she was allegedly in a trance, and what she said was taken down. It's amazing, colourful imagery. Oliver Cromwell as a persecuting bull, and carnivalesque history of the times in an apocalyptic mode. But it's of a piece with Abiezer Kopp's reworking of biblical imagery.
Yeah, this is fascinating because in my conversation with Bernard, I think the Fifth Monarchists ended up a little dour, a little straight-laced, which certainly befits the Calvinist. But this element of them,
I think there's another side to it.
Yes, this is the Book of Revelation coming out.
I would feel something was very wrong if I was disagreeing with Bernard Capp.
I'm not saying you're disagreeing with Bernard Capp.
No. That's good. So there. I think there is an antinomian edge to Fifth Monarchism, and so a kind of a highly enthusiastic imagination.
Yeah, this sounds like Blake almost. I keep making these connections to the Romantics, but
that's right, and you need. We probably talked about E.P. Thompson's Witness Against the Beast.
No, we did not.
Right, and you haven't read it.
I have not read it.
Well, so E.P. Thompson, the great.
Yes, I mean, I guess explain for the listeners who E.P. Thompson is. I'm sorry.
Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, was a left-wing historian, mostly concerned with the 18th and the 19th centuries, the history of the English working class, the British proletariat as it emerged in the Industrial Revolution. And he was very good at tying the great works of Romanticism to that history, that people's history. So his great work is The Making of the English Working Classes. It's still a great work.
I agree. It's a great book. That book I have read, and it is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, we are not worthy. And one of the things he got interested in, he'd been, I do believe he was a little younger than Christopher Hill, the historian, the left-wing historian of the 17th century. But I think they were both interested in making links. And Thompson got interested in exploring the what happened to radical sectarianism, radical Puritanism after 1660, after the failure of the English Revolution. And he found some evidence that William Blake's mother may have been a Muggletonian. And so Witness Against the Beast is really, it's not a proof, it's a history of his journey of discovery. And the amazing thing was that what the book also, well, there's a book before it called The World of the Muggletonians. Thompson found the last Muggletonian, who was an apple farmer in Kent. And the thing with the Muggletonians is you had to accept the authority of the two original prophets. So Lodowick Muggleton and John Reeve claimed to be the two last prophets named in the Book of Revelation. And to be saved, you just had to accept that. And the Muggletonians had a very artisanally appropriate materialist cosmology, that God was like a bloke, as we say in England, a guy who lived 3 miles above the surface of the earth. He was a bearded gentleman. And they had one, they survived into the 18th century and into the 19th century and into the 20th century. And they rather secretive little ultra-Protestant sect. and they had an annual dinner, the Muggletonians' dinner, and they were very good at flying under the radar of the law. And so, in a house in London was their archive. And the thing about Muggletonian life is that this is, I believe how it works. You had to say to whoever you choose to say to, do you accept the authority of Muggleton and Reeve as the two last prophets? Most people are going to say no, and you're going to say, well, then you're damned. And some people wouldn't, and that's how they kept going as a very small group. They kept reprinting their works, and the archive was in a house in London, their headquarters, as it were, where they met once a year for a hearty meal. That house was bombed in the Second World War, and I forget the name of the last Muggletonian, Philip someone. He heard about this, and with his Apple truck, he drove in, through the smoke of blitzed London, went to the house, and from its smoking ruins, took what was left of the Muggletonian archive. And in the 1980s, you could buy some of these works. I wish I was a penniless graduate student then, so I couldn't afford anything. But you could buy these books of 18th and 19th century reprints of earlier 17th century works. And the sect was going to die out with this gentleman because he couldn't bring himself to give his two daughters, the prophetic witness, because he couldn't bear the thought that they would say, you're off your rocker, Dad. And then he'd have to tell them they were damned. So I think that's how it works.
Wow.
And in that community, Clarkson ended up.
Right, of course. Yes, that's the connective tissue to Blake, and this undercurrent of radicalism which pops up in Britain and indeed in the United States for centuries.
Think, there's a lot you can say is in common with Leveller supporters. These are artisan people. They're tradespeople. Barrel makers. They make money and they need to be literate to do so. And they're more likely to be urban than rural. And they're quite, so long as they prevail in business, they're quite happy to look after themselves, and they don't want to be interfered with by a state religion which they might come to regard as ridiculous.
Yeah, well, that's what I focused on. That's what I focused on with Bernard Capp, was the Fifth Monarchist's desire to implement a state religion. And I think that's why we focus less on the sort of outlandish nature of their ideals. We talked about this a little bit before. I believe you are the first and maybe only guest I've got lined up in this series who is from the field of literature, like I am, as opposed to the field of history. And your book, or the second revised edition of it, draws some real parallels between the Ranters and the punk elements resonating with the radicalism of the 20th century.
Okay, that's good. So the second edition of the Ranters, which I published in 2014, that's to say an anthology of, I think, practically all of the known writings, and more were known in 2014 than were known when I first published it as a graduate student in 1983. And also, it's fair to say that the parallels between post-Second World War culture and this aspect of 17th century radicalism had not been seen in 1983. Some of them had, but others were not. And certainly the connection with punk hadn't been mapped out because punk was happening.
Yeah,
punk was new. I read the Ranters first as a second year undergraduate, I think a second year undergraduate. That would have been 1978. That was when it was happening. The bit that in a fit of enthusiasm in putting the Ranter materials together for the second edition that made me miss something is that, of course, the Ranters were in the memory of the folk protest movement of the 1960s. So not loud, brash electric guitars with swear words, but Pete Seeger, as it were, and a British counterpart to Seeger, who got a lot of attention in the earlier 60s and had spots on television as a kind of guitar strumming prophet, Leon Russellson, who wrote a series of really great songs about the English radicals. And to my shame, I failed to get a paragraph or two on Leon in, though I should have done. And indeed, when we had a public event launching the book at the LRB bookshop, the London Review of Books bookshop, near the British Museum in Bloomsbury in London, Leon came out and played his song about Abbé Ézécoppe. I think the most striking aspect of the briefly lived ranter movement in the 17th century, what connected with hippies in the late 1960s and punks in the later 1970s, was their theatrical, gestural, highly gestural language of protest, that it was an instant demonstration of, we're not taking the forms of oppression that you're putting on us, and this is our way of telling you so. The question of whether the Ranters really pursued free love, whatever we decide that means. There was, of course, some of that in the late 60s. So far as I know, not much of it at all in punk. The key. So what I was doing in the 2000 in the preface and the revised introduction to the 2014 edition was picking up on what had been said, and the highly influential historian of music in modern American culture, Grail Marcus, surely has a claim to be one of Bob Dylan's chroniclers in the most perceptive way. I had, and of course, Grail writes about many other figures in popular culture. I met him at Princeton. He taught for Princeton for a bit early in my time here, and somebody took me to meet him, and we did talk about the Ranters. And one thing that people may not realize is that Grail regarded as his UK counterpart, as a historian of popular music and its cultural dimensions, Nick Cohn, Kohn, and it was Nick Cohn's father, Norman Cohn, who wrote the famous book The Pursuit of the Millennium, which was really about mystical anarchists in the Middle Ages, but it had an anthology of ranter texts which he saw as an echo. So I think Grail had a sort of sense of personal connection, and he wanted to write he offered to write a foreword for my edition and then couldn't do it, so I wrote it instead. But it is a testimony to people like Christopher Hill, who and A.L. Morton. He's true, a non-academic British communist scholar. One of his books, The World of the Ranters, published in 1970, picking up on the analogy with the hippies. Those books were widely available, especially in small left-wing bookshops in campuses near your hometown across the UK. And as punk broke out, and people found different ways of doing it. So some of those, there were bands, punk and post-punk bands, who picked it up. So there was a band called the Levelers, and you better call them up. I think they're still around. And
they are still around. I doubt they'll come on my show, but I am going to ask them. Why not?
Yeah, you better do that. And and the Mekons, who Grail Marcus particularly revered, and their song, it's called "The Old Road to Jerusalem."
Yes,
which opens one of their albums, and I think that's a brilliant running together of the in the compressed space of a song lyric of the contents of Hill's "The World Turned Upside Down" and E.P. Thompson's "The Making of the English Working Classes" and other works. So yeah. I don't know if that gives you a context. My personal view about the legacy of radicalism is that it doesn't belong to anyone, and the basic leveler ideas are enshrined in British political practice. So it's not as if they belong to any particular movement, although of course they were seen as the Labour movement, and the Labour Party emerged in the early 20th century. The historiography of the Levellers at that stage was connected to them. But where we are now, I think the groups like the Ranters are for everyone to draw something from, whatever your position is. I used to think the Ranters were just really exciting on account of the complexity and delightfulness and sheer fun of their protest and their sense of self-irony. With Abiezer Kopp saying, I've got God inside me, but don't tell anyone. So hilariously, there was a kind of wisdom, a self-reflective wisdom about what they believed they had in their possession. So I thought it was all fun. With 40 years of life lived in between, the more we know about some of the sexual ideas of the Ranters, the more it's kind of terrifying. How would that work? Although, of course, there have been many experiments, and I think that many of the Ranters were Baptists and probably went back to being Baptists. And there were some experiments to produce polygamous societies, sort of Baptists as Mormons, in the years after the return of the monarchy. Almost, I think all of these instances are exiled communities which had trouble sustaining themselves and were not well tolerated. The language that they use in their writings is not very far different from some of the Ranter texts. So I again, the Baptists would not be keen on, they certainly wouldn't be keen on that sort of thing being known in the 1670s through to the 1770s. They wouldn't want it known. And so we're still recovering those connections. There wasn't a Ranter party any more than there was a Leveller party. There was a sense that there was this huge transformation going on. Society through the Civil War had become completely dislocated. It must have been incredibly shocking. And people thought that the last times were upon them and that they were going to be rapturously transformed. One impulse was, in a sense, the position that actually we might be able to rise. They called it rising above ordinances, by which they meant we don't need to go to church anymore. We'll just be imminently in a state of grace as people on this earth. We will have reverted to the state of Adam and Eve before the fall. And with the coming down to immediate causes, once the republic had been created, the monarchy had ended, the king was executed, abolition of the House of Lords and the episcopal, the bishops, everything is up for grabs. And then the Levellers are defeated. Their proposals don't make it into the new order. And also the Diggers don't. And on the back of what I think somebody like Abiezer Kopp saw as a problem with the Diggers is that the solution wasn't in doing anything materially, as it were. That, in fact, if you looked within yourself, we were already transformed. And as Kopp saw it, the real blight was selfishness. Selfishness produced by Calvinist theology, which had underwritten, as it were, the natural urge to hold on to what you've got in a society which was largely riven with poverty. So I think that the failure of the English Revolution, as it were, the defeat of the Levellers, and the fact that the Diggers, as it were, weren't winning, would lead him to project an instant, what he calls spirit leveling, which shouldn't be confused with spirit level. So he had the theology of claiming that God was in you, that there wasn't anything such as sin. Sin was a mechanism for disciplining people, projected by the ruling classes and their hench persons, the clergy in the established church. The truth was other. And the first thing we will do is end hoarding up things. We will share everything we've got, and therefore everything will be good and everyone will be happy. The meaning of Kopp's extraordinary language of gesture, and he describes extravagantly running through the streets of London, kissing the foulest people he can find, showing proving the arrival of selflessness by embracing them and enjoying a community of spirit. And that is quite astonishing and striking. It was interpreted as disruptive, subversive of the order, and profoundly dangerous. We have to remember that everyone assumed that there was a divine economy of rewards and punishments, and society was ordered as it was in order to those rewards and punishments appropriately lived out on God's earth. So even though there had been a substantial revision of the English Constitution, as Ariel very, very capably showed in his talk, there was still a way to go. So I think that the Copts protests, if we can call it a language of protest gestures, which also included swearing as a way of attacking Calvinist predestination theology, because it turned out that it was merely a form of torture. So I see maybe there are three ways, there are three kinds of ranterism. There's no evidence, as far as I can see, in anything that Kopp wrote, or evidence that we actually have about him, that he practiced free love. Lawrence Clarkson did practice a kind of sleeping with other people, with women out of wedlock, in the name of the free spirit, as a fulfillment of the fact that God was in all of us, and we as it were, sex was a celebration of that and an acknowledgement of it. That, of course, is a theology, if you will, a theology of divine immanence, which is shared with Winstanley and the Diggers. And so we have to remember that during the life of the commune on St George's Hill in Surrey, that there was a ranter invasion at one point. It's not clear how it happened, but Winstanley wrote an outraged and affrighted tract about these ranters coming among them. And if you've seen the movie about Winstanley by Kevin Brownlow from 1975, that's one of there's a ranter moment in the film.
I haven't seen that film. I've meant to for a while. Definitely, I believe it is available online. I'll put a link to it.
The third thing is the job of the I'm simplifying this. The evidence about ranterism is complex, and I might say a little bit more about that as we go on. But the third main thing is the image of ranterism generated by hostile press, and the main thing is the presentation of ranting as a kind of nearly satanic ritual. People getting together in inns, taking their clothes off, eating and drinking heartily, and doing what they wanted to do. There was a lot of it's presented as ritualistic, and there's although I don't think it's identified as witchcraft, there's something of profoundly anti-Christian and pagan about the way it's being presented. That's not really the view that you get in Lawrence Clarkson's writing, a single eye, all light, no darkness. That's really more like I hate to use the word Nietzschean, but it's because we just be being anachronistic. But a bit like the genealogy of morals, it does invert conventional categories he's saying basically there's no difference between the light forces and the dark forces, and it's all one in the divine energy that permeates where we are. And it's Clarkson's theology, which he can, he's barely able to express it. He's an artisanal person, and literacy would have been beyond him and until quite late in his life, or later in his life. But that many of the ideas that he appears to be expressing belong with what's becoming better known as esoteric religion at the time, and in the hands of educated people is interesting, as it were, and different. But in the context of Clarkson and his travels through the countryside, putting out ranter views. It's, of course, much more disturbing.
Okay, a couple things I want to jump in and say. Well, first of all, when you were talking about this sort of Nietzschean view, and also when you were talking about immanence, all I was thinking about was Emerson. And I think we can do the connection here in that Nietzsche was deeply influenced by Emerson, in my view, although plenty of the Germans think this isn't true, although Nietzsche himself says he's very influenced by Emerson, so that's good enough for me. The second thing is Emerson is deeply, deeply influenced by radical Protestant traditions. And this idea of eminence is crucial to Emerson and seems to me crucial to
Yes.
radical Protestant traditions. The other thing is, though, for people who have conventional understandings of Christianity, Christianity is the opposite of eminence, right? Like it's like, oh, there's nothing here. It's all in the other world. Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, that's what you're putting is, if you will, a Platonic view of Christianity. I would think there would be many unorthodox or heterodox thinkers, some of them quite elite, in the early modern period, who would take a very different view. And the poet John Milton, the poet of the English Revolution, didn't believe that. He thought that his mature position was monistic, so he thought that everything was one substance. There was just lesser or greater refinement in the cosmos, in God's creation. So the action is very much with us in the here and now. And of course, this the connection between Milton, one of the most learned English people there'll ever be, I think. The connection between Milton, government official, civil servant for the Commonwealth, and the radicals is something that inspired Christopher Hill, and it's something that you can still talk about today, and we're still learning about it.
Nigel, as soon as we started talking and I was thinking about how we were both in the English department, I thought, oh no, there's another episode I need to add to this series.
If you want me, I'll talk to you about Milton if you want.
Well, let's not do that right now, at least, because we need to give the ranters their due. But oh boy, Milton.
No, although I was referring to the Baptists and the attempt to set up polygamous colonies in the 1660s and 70s, which happened inside the German-speaking world. A group of about 100 English Baptists went and did that. They were in large part inspired by some of Milton's divorce writings. So there is a real explicit connection. Getting hold of the texts that prove it has taken time, but something appeared in manuscript in Germany in 2019 in English. It's an argument for divorce, so that people who become convinced of being a particular Baptist can divorce their spouse, who is a not believer, and marry their true lover, who is somebody in the church. So and then in the middle of the tract it says, and the best thing of all is polygamy, but it's pretty hard to bring off. So that's the best way of doing it, because that's what they were doing in the Old Testament. So I think that in this highly complex, highly charged, heterodox language, where many things are up for grab, all of a sudden, the crossover between elite and non-elite, or educated and non-educated, is simply one of the exciting border crossings of the period. So yes, you should have a show on Milton.
So I guess I have too many thoughts now, but I need to push on with the polygamy thing, because obviously, looking back, there's a huge critique right now, and has been at least since the 80s, of the free love period of the 60s for having not actually been free love, but more like free love for men.
Free love for men. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
And is this what the ranters were practicing also? Not free love, but polygamy, to put it a different way.
You raise a good question. There are some sort of, there's a little, after the ranters were, there were two acts of Parliament, the Blasphemy Act and then the Adultery Act, which were introduced to shut the ranters down, to have a law to act on. And the penalties for the Adultery Act were very severe. Although I think what they were trying to do was basically get people to shut up and stop doing this. But
no more ranting.
no
That
more.
was the real
No,
problem.
there were a few noises from Kopp and others a few years later, and there's a treatise that is attributed. I'd attribute it to Kopp, called Divine Fireworks from 1657, which is, I mean, it describes an oncoming fiery apocalypse. And one of the things it rails against is posh women wearing makeup, women acting above their station. And it says, and it's really unpleasant. It says, when this fire comes, you will smell burning flesh. And it really means it. And what I take that to, I mean, one interpretation you might draw from that is that inside ranterism, if this is what it is, there's a kind of response to the empowerment of women as it could happen in that time, where fine manners, courtesy, and cosmetics were being used to create a women's space. I think that the response from your radical Puritan, who might think that sharing everything is the answer, is that this is a threat. So that's a fairly, in the corpus of evidence that we have about the Ranters, that's a fairly small piece of it, but I think it's quite interesting and significant, and it's certainly true that although you do have the sense, I mean, there are some letters from Kopp once he gets imprisoned in Coventry with some other people, and he writes to one of the other Ranters, and he says that somebody called Mistress Seeney, or maybe you would have said her name, Cheney, she's been with them, she's been locked up in another part of the jail, but we're all together and we have a common understanding and a sense of some responsibility for her and protectiveness. So I think there's evidence that there were women involved in the gestural protest, and that they were sort of on the road, as if you will, as a ranter show, doing that. With Clarkson, you get the sense that he's just convinced that marriage customs no longer matter, so it's fine for him to go and sleep with somebody else. There's no sense of what he's doing as a kind of subjection. There is I think this is in Joseph Salmon's. It's a if you read his recantation, one of his 2 recantation tracts carefully, he's basically saying, we really thought we were angels on earth, or Adam and Eve on earth before the fall. And the kind of free relationships we had with each other, we radically underestimated how this would be seen as whoredom by those who were outside of it. It was a tragic mistake. And given how social gender politics worked in 17th century England, he was surely right. That anything that wasn't, the women who were not part of their fathers' or their parents' families, or were married to somebody, that if they were operating outside of that, they were very vulnerable, and the charge that they were loose women would be, very, very easy to make. So I think that the Ranters had generally reached the conclusion that they were perfected and they had grace, and that was beginning to make them behave in ways that most people would find deeply disturbing. There isn't much evidence that allows us to think about whether there was a gender hierarchy in that. I think one of the things that radical religion in the English Revolution is noted for is the spiritual equality of men and women. You remember Rachel said that one of the leveler positions is that there are no innate hierarchies. And, Milton also argues that, by the way. And there's a sense with the Ranters that, and the Quakers, that men and women are in their spirituals totally equal, and that they are not the weaker sex on that level. So, and I think that's behind the kind of sense of common cause that you have in with women in some of Kopp's writing. There isn't evidence by them, by people we can reliably identify as ranters, about their sense of gender equality or gender hierarchy. To jump into the dangerous quagmire of modern parallels, the 2018 film by Thomas Clay, Fanny Lie Delivered, which attempts to recreate what would have happened if some ranters got let loose on a Puritan household. That is the complications of that are acted out and explored quite well, and I'd simply commend anyone to go and watch the movie. In the view of the hostile press and the way the ranters were treated in the courts of law, they were behaving lewdly and improperly, and it was monstrous. The fact that no serious penalties were exacted of them, no one was executed or even banished, where Lilburn was banished for a while, is a measure of, I think, the success of the suppression of it. The protests that have been, as it were, in the realm of political thought and constitutional life, and then in the social structure with the diggers, had actually got into the order of the family. That's really very dangerous indeed. And there must have been few people who could have sympathized with that. But the theology, the antinomian theology, had its followers, and at that stress point in 1649 to 50, where the radicals had been shut out of the arrangements that made the English Republic, the pre-protectorate Commonwealth. That's the stress point. That's where, as it were, something gives, and the recourse to this kind of, it almost has an air of desperation about it. But you can imagine that Kopp would have thought that people could instantly make selfishness disappear if everyone kissed everyone else. There's something very John and Yoko about it, isn't there?
So I hesitate to bring this up at this point because this is sort of Protestantism 101, but it's something that's been tickling in the back of my mind the whole time you've been talking. So when we think about the Calvinism that undermined a great deal of Puritanism, the idea is something like, or I guess like the anti-Calvinist or the Catholic idea is like antinomianism, the idea that there are no rules, that you can do whatever you want, is a sort of logical consequence of Calvinism. So if you are saved, you can do whatever you want. And obviously the history of concepts like the Protestant work ethic and that sort of thing is there's a real bizarre contradiction at the heart of Protestantism, is it seems like these people have a theology that says they can do whatever they want. They can drink wine and have sex and sin freely. But those goddamn Protestants, they don't do any of that stuff. In fact, they're much more godly than the Catholics, even though it seems like they have been authorized to do whatever they want. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is that the Ranters take this idea to the place that the Catholics are afraid that the Protestants are going to take it. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely correct. Well, the Protestant, the Lutheran complaint against the Roman Church was that it was corrupt.
Yeah,
and that it was too lax. And that's driven to a greater degree in a sort of more refined conceptual way inside Calvin's writings. So I'm sure some Puritans would have regarded Ranterism as a kind of popery and a reversion to old ways. It is absolutely true that Abiezer Kopp was a poor boy who was gotten hold of by Calvinist teachers and was so taken up with a kind of process of mortification to find out whether he was doing the right thing, the godly thing every day. He talks about this, and he talks about how it had to be overthrown. So I think there's a very, very clear example. So Ranterism and the people who wanted to live without a visible church order and thought they were strong enough in the Lord, so to speak, to do that. The Seekers, they were called. From the Seekers come the Ranters. That's how it's usually explained. They had lost faith in the disciplinary mechanisms of Protestantism. How the church structures of the Christian church had been reformed in the Protestant Reformation, and then further reformed with the victory of Puritanism in the 1640s. So and especially the Presbyterian church order was something that I think was vexing. The Congregationalists, or the Independents, as Ariel was explaining, with their autonomous church structure, that's more. I think that was more in tune with figures like Cobb. Clarkson, I think, is as it were from outside of the idea of education as part and parcel of Reformation, from a world of if not brute agricultural labor, then craftsmanship, getting hold of such knowledge tools. He had some alchemical manuscripts which he said he used to kind of equip himself to be a lay preacher. So one of the contexts in which we can understand Ranterism is of the throwing off of traditional clerical authority, that people could make churches outside of episcopally governed or even Presbyterianly governed church structures. They can just decide to make a holy community as they wish, because the Spirit is with them. That's Lutheranism, the priesthood of all believers. We're all priests, and that's how the theology of justification by faith alone works. So yes, you're quite right to point to the fundamental building blocks of Protestantism as opposed to the Roman Church, with its reliance on tradition, of course, and the structures that come with that. The Ranter context is to be seen as a way of making a godly community, and they were absolutely sure that they had God or the Holy Spirit inside them, and when they opened their mouths, they spoke with it. Then they wanted to be like that and free themselves of what had become intolerable forms of discipline, which to them were painful and unrewarding in lives that had little prospects. So that's the way it was. There's a Ranterish people, if they were sufficiently middle class, I think, could have assimilated into the kind of mystical versions of pietism that grow in the later 17th century and into the 18th century, and are very recognizable, aren't they, in the later American pre-bellum religious spectrum. Eastern Pennsylvania, right?
Yes.
Full of Germans from Halle, and the Ephrata community, for instance, would be a very good example of that kind of identity, a celibate community. Of course, but celibacy is another way of doing all of this.
Yeah, it's another way of doing it differently.
Yeah.
Whatever, it's not the same as free love, but what it is very much not a single bonded pair in marriage.
I've got a couple of two things that I should say. The category that is usually treated from the 17th into the 18th century as a negative category, the enthusiasm. That is to say, you believe that you are possessed by the Holy Spirit, and or indeed, Holy Spirit in the traditional Trinitarian formulation is part of the Godhead, and that empowers you to do what you have to do. This, of course, is regarded as irrational. It widely theorized as a form of mental illness. I think any of the English radicals could be described as succumbing to an enthusiastic pathology. And one of the things we now know, we didn't have a very strong view of this, archival evidence with digitization, manuscript church books and so on, much more of that has been recovered. The actual debates of the reception of the ranting materials are quite interesting. This has been written up by people, and I think we're going to find more of this. And one of the things that I hope you'll be able to explore as you talk to more people is the with this newly recovered world of considerable manuscript, handwriting records of the English Revolution, is people saying, "Oh yeah, we've read this agreement of the people. We had a go at deploying some of it in our little local corporation, and maybe this might work." That's more evidence that helps dispel the idea that these writings didn't mean anything except exuberant extremism in the time they began.
It sounds like what we've got here is that the Ranters were, in some ways, rebelling against the conventional views in a way that would be terrifying to a conventional or authoritarian way of being. And so then now the difficulty is picking out what parts of the Ranters' behaviors were the actual things the Ranters believed and did, and what is the obvious fantasy that a authority figure would think the Ranters were believing and doing once they have claimed that they have God in them and they can do whatever they want. And if I've understanding that correctly, that seems to be the central problem with the Ranters, is it's hard to unpick what they were doing from what the authorities were fantasizing they were doing.
I admire your clarity of judgment there. I think that's really it. I think Abiezer Kopp wanted not unlike punks to say, let's stop being pretentious. Pretentious means we harm each other. Let's acknowledge a common humanity, which is actually a divinity too, and let's stop people being oppressed and impoverished. We can all enjoy a commonwealth. Clarkson is somewhat different, and it's an astonishing and in some ways quite troubling alternative theology, which says, as the phrase was, we're all one flesh, and you know what that means. So, let's enjoy it as we can. That was very troubling, and it would probably trouble most of us today. And we couldn't. Of course, people in the late 60s and in the years afterwards did live in alternative forms of relationship or open relationships, which is still, much is made of that. If you read the BBC News website, everything's about the end of monogamous relationships. But I think Clarkson was trying to project something quite different in terms of sexual relationships. But what he's talking about, and the other texts that belong with that side of the Ranter corpus, that's quite different, I think, from the way in which Ranter orgies are written up in the hostile literature.
I just think this example is perfect, Nigel. I don't think any of us know right now how to unpack the current sexual practices from the mainstream media's terrified write-up of these changes in sexual practices that are so scary. How would you unpack them? How can you disentangle them? I can't disentangle them in 2023.
That's a very good point. And the fact that medical knowledge and best medical advice is part of the current predicament. It has its resonances in the 17th century, where quite elevated people, highly educated divines, have theological positions which aren't too removed. One final example, which I think is really revealing, and recently recovered evidence enables us to understand it. There was one of the perfectionist sects that emerges from basically the Rhineland, the family of love. So Hendrik Nicolai's earlier and mid-16th century self-proclaimed prophet with his own retinue of writing. And I think most of his career as a merchant was spent in Cologne. And the family's writings were spread far and wide in Northern Europe, and the family's proselytizers came to England in the Elizabethan period, in the late 16th century. The family of love are seen as basically seekers. Kopp's early writing, where he's basically trying to throw off the educational system. He's basically saying conventional Latin grammar is a weird, decayed, mistaken way of actually getting access to the Holy Spirit. And this is what it really means, and this is what it should mean. And at that point, he invokes the family of love. One of the questions is, were there hidden pockets of familists in England through the period down into the later 17th century? And the answer is yes. So these were typically familists would be church wardens, the people who did they'd have middling sort callings, but they'd keep the church in order. And the familist profession is, if you accept my authority, you're saved. My authority, the authority of Hendrik Nicolais, and you must, in order to preserve that sacredness, you must adopt the religion of whatever is the public religion of wherever you are. You must be Nicodemists. Well, the man who married Milton for the third time, a sometime fellow of Christ's College, Cambridge, Robert Gell, or Gell, Gell, who had a rich living in central London and a great library. And he argued, he's a very, very learned man. He was trying to reconcile different systems of divinity, including, as it were, Christian alchemy with Orthodox Protestantism. He wanted to he proposed retranslating the Bible to take the suicide. He thought it was the English translations were too Calvinist, too predestinarian, and he was very concerned about a suicide principle or a despair principle being buried inside English Protestantism by these translations. And at the point of the Restoration, he goes to the Bishop of London and says, okay, so the rules have changed, and Gell is, in many ways very respectable, and he says, look, I've got these guys in my congregation, and they're familists. We've been happily getting along for the last 20 years, and would it be okay, Mr. Bishop, if I let them carry on being familists? And the answer was, are you kidding? No. So and this has been very well written up by the Stanford historian David Como, who's done some of the most archivally exciting work. So you might want to talk to him. But that I think that's a really interesting example of radicalism being assimilated. So John was honest enough or foolish enough to take it to Sheldon, the Bishop of London. But if you weren't in the capital, would you have to do that? Not necessarily. And so I wonder. So radicalism assimilates, and there's there was a guy who did some work on the free miners of Derbyshire in the 18th century, who appeared to be using leveller language to justify the right to walk out onto the high peak in Derbyshire and do some mining, go into a pothole and dig out whatever it was, whether it's a coal or precious metal. Whereas the local landowners were becoming industrial capitalists and were trying to develop coal mines as we know them. And so they didn't want this going on. And they claimed that they owned the right to do it. So the question is, where did that language come from across 100 years?
Yeah, and the idea that some of these communities in America in the 19th century, we know they were influenced by Quakers and Mennonites and Bohemians, but the idea that they weren't ranters seems to me almost obvious now. And yet I hadn't thought about that lineage in the slightest. But now I have to let you go. I've already kept you too long. I enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you, Nigel.
It was great. We'll be in touch.